Chicago never slept, but inside the private suite of the St. Regis Tower, with its walls of glass curving high above the lake, everything felt impossibly still. Chloe Murphy sat alone on a velvet armchair, her reflection suspended against the city's skyline. Skyscrapers blinked like 1,000 watchful eyes, their silver glints fractured in the dark waters of Lake Michigan. She wore no makeup, no gown, just a simple cream blouse tucked into faded jeans, her curls gathered in a loose knot at the nape of her neck. She looked nothing like a fiancée, and even less like a woman who had just been handed the most powerful contract of her life. On the low glass table in front of her lay a single sheet of paper, illuminated by the chandelier's soft gold. It gleamed with the cold authority of something that wasn't love, wasn't choice, only obligation dressed as opportunity. A marriage agreement. Unromantic, clinical, binding. Across from her sat William Walker. At 36, his name carried more weight on LaSalle Street than most corporations could dream of. He was the son of a dynasty older than most banks, and the CEO of Walker Holdings, the kind of empire that bought towers, rather than rented offices inside them. His hair was dark immaculate. His custom Tom Ford suit bore not a crease out of place. Even his cufflinks whispered of arrogance. Platinum discreet, but heavy with worth, and his eyes, steel blue, sharp, untouched by warmth. He didn't look at her, not once. His focus remained on the phone in his palm, his fingers dancing over numbers as if orchestrating the world's balance sheet in real time. Chloe swallowed her throat dry, her palms damp against her knees. Her voice came out quieter than she intended. So, that's it. William's head didn't lift. His tone was even deep stripped of care. Sign it. 2 words. No hesitation. The paper before her spelled everything out in blunt, relentless type. For no less than 12 months, Miss Chloe Murphy shall in good faith enter into a legal marriage with Mr. William Walker for the reputational interests of both parties as agreed upon by the Walker Family Trust and the Murphy estate. No poetry, no illusion of affection. A business merger thinly veiled in vows. Chloe stared at the black ink until the lines blurred. Her chest felt tight, as if the whole room had tilted against her. I thought, she whispered, eyes still locked on the document, your family wanted someone. From a corporate background. That made him pause. His gaze rose at last, meeting hers. It was like being pinned beneath ice. My family doesn't care where you come from. William said, each syllable deliberate. They care that you're agreeable, uncomplicated. And his lips curved in the faintest, most merciless hint of irony. Discreet. Her heart clenched. She understood exactly what he meant. They wanted a woman who would not embarrass them. A black woman who would smile on command pose in the right gowns and never give the press a headline sharper than her silhouette. A chess piece placed where it served, silenced when it did not. She forced her voice steady. Why me? His shoulders leaned back against the sofa, casual, infuriatingly composed. Because you're the perfect solution, he said. Your father owes mine. You're educated. You present well, and you won't demand more than what's offered. Chloe blinked, her lips parting. You don't even know me. I don't need to. His tone cut like polished glass. This isn't about you. It's about optics, control, business. There it was. No pretense, no flowers hiding thorns, just steel. She lowered her eyes to the pen resting beside the contract. Her chest rose and fell too fast. Do I at least get a ring? She asked. A bitter laugh caught in her throat. William's expression barely shifted. You'll have a ceremony. a dress, a press release, whatever optics require. But don't mistake any of it for romance, Miss Murphy. She should have walked away. She should have told him that no empire, no fortune was worth her freedom. But she didn't. Because across the city in a hospice ward, smelling faintly of lavender and disinfectant, her grandmother's medical bills had already been paid quietly, discreetly by the Walker Foundation. Because her younger brother had just received sudden acceptance letters from universities they could never have afforded, doors that had somehow swung open without knocking. Because power did not whisper in this city. It roared. And William Walker controlled the volume. Her hand trembled as she lifted the pen. Her name bled black across the paper. Something inside her fractured. When she raised her eyes, William was already on his feet, smoothing his jacket. "The wedding is in 4 weeks," he said. "You'll receive a schedule. PR will coach you. Designers will take your measurements." He reached the door before she could speak. But just before leaving, he turned. "I don't expect you to love me," William said evenly. "And I will not love you. But if you play your part, you'll never lack anything." And then he was gone. The silence that followed was deafening. Chloe sat back down on the velvet couch, staring at the city through the glass. Not a fiancé, not a woman, a placeholder in a billionaire's world, but placeholders she thought had their own kind of power. And one day, even placeholders learned how to change the game. 4 weeks later, the city watched them. The ceremony at Holy Name Cathedral was flawless, every detail choreographed to perfection. Imported orchids spilled down the pews, and golden filigree-etched champagne flutes gleamed beneath the chandeliers of the reception hall. The guest list was a litany of senators, fashion moguls, media titans, all toasting to a love story they knew, deep down, did not exist. Chloe walked down the aisle in a custom Vera Wang gown, silk sliding over her skin like water. Her cathedral-length veil trailed behind her, weightless. Her hands did not shake. Her smile was measured warm enough for cameras, distant enough for survival. The Walker family sat in the front pew, regal, composed, their nods, subtle, satisfied. At the altar, William stood in his tailored suit, face, unreadable posture, flawless. He did not look at her until the priest asked him to take her hand. Then finally his eyes turned, blue against brown. And for the briefest, most dangerous moment, something nameless flickered. His hand was warm, steady, commanding as hers slid into it. The vows were recited, the rings exchanged, their lips brushed, not quite a kiss, not quite nothing. And with that, it was done. Chloe Murphy ceased to exist. In her place, Chloe Walker, an empire's bride, a silence dressed in silk. That night, when the heavy doors of their penthouse sealed behind them with a quiet finality, she did not cry. The rooms were dazzling glass walls, gold light marble floors, gleaming like frozen rivers. But it was a palace that felt more like a cage. William loosened his tie, already glancing toward his study. He didn't speak until she asked, voice soft but steady. "So, that's it." His pause was brief. Then his gaze flickered toward her, detached. "You expected more." "I expected acknowledgement," she whispered. "Not love, not passion, just something human." For a fraction of a second his eyes shifted. Exhaustion lurked there, shadows beneath his restraint. But as quickly as it came, it was gone. "You signed for a future," William said. "That's what you have. Don't mistake me for something I'm not." Her lips trembled. Not even a husband. He looked at her silent, unreadable. and turned to the window, staring down at the city pulsing below them. "I won't interfere with your life," he said at last, "and I expect the same." Chloe's voice broke in a whisper. "You're afraid." His head snapped slightly. "You think if you let me close, I'll take something from you." "But I never asked for your heart, William," she said. "Only your honesty." He didn't reply. She turned, walking toward the grand staircase. Each step echoed like a verdict. Alone, she peeled the gown from her body layer by layer, until only her slip remained. The diamond ring on her finger glinted sharp as frost. She stared at herself in the mirror. This was her wedding night, a night without tenderness, without even a good night. She pressed her palm against the glass. Beyond it, Chicago glittered unforgiving, alive, waiting. And Chloe made herself a quiet promise. She had surrendered her name. She had surrendered her choice. But she would not surrender her voice. The story of Chloe and William is only beginning. A marriage forged in cold contracts, tempered by silence and shadowed by power, can only fracture or transform. Would you have signed, or would you have walked away? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'll be reading everyone. If Chloe's story stirred you even a little, tap the like button so we know you're here with us on this journey. And if you're curious to see how a placeholder in a billionaire's world learns to change the game, hit follow. Because trust me, what's coming next will surprise you. The penthouse was a palace. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the city like a restless painting. Lake Michigan, glimmering steel blue in the mornings, Chicago's skyline set aflame by sunset, the endless rhythm of headlights threading the streets below. Every corner gleamed polished marble glass, chandeliers, rugs imported from Paris, art pieces whose names Chloe had only ever seen in textbooks. It should have dazzled her. It should have been intoxicating, stepping into a world so far from the cramped apartment she had once shared with her grandmother. But nothing glittered enough to quiet the silence. William Walker did not speak unless necessity demanded it. At breakfast, he sat at one end of a dining table so long it could seat 20, skimming the Times, while an untouched espresso cooled at his elbow. Chloe sat 3 chairs away, her plate decorated with food. She never touched her coffee, laced with cinnamon and oat milk. Words hovered on her tongue, but she swallowed them down. The silence wasn't just awkward. It was measured, the kind that felt like it had been engineered to remind her of her place. In those first weeks, she learned his rhythms the way a musician memorizes an unfamiliar score. He rose at 6, showered in water that hissed like rain against glass, and was out the door before 7. In a convoy of black cars. He returned late, the city already cloaked in night tie, loosened eyes, ringed faintly with fatigue, but never softening. He took his dinner standing more often than sitting, made phone calls behind the frosted glass doors of his study, and disappeared into the master bedroom that remained forbidden territory. Her world was reduced to the echo of his footsteps, the faint clink of ice against crystal, the rustle of newspapers, and the distant hum of his voice on conference calls. Sometimes she caught him looking at her, fleeting glances sharp as lightning, but they vanished before she could decipher them. And so Chloe found her own ways to fill the hollow hours. One evening, restless, she wandered beyond the curated halls. The penthouse stretched endlessly, rooms, more like galleries than living spaces, vases that had never seen flowers. Shelves lined with books whose spines had never been cracked. It was behind a heavy oak door that she found it. A music room. The Steinway Grand gleamed black beneath the amber light. No dust touched its surface, no fingerprints marred the keys. It was perfect, untouched, the kind of instrument meant for display rather than sound. And yet Chloe felt something stir in her chest as she stepped closer. Her grandmother had owned an old upright piano, scarred and uneven, stationed in the corner of their living room back in Atlanta. On humid Sunday afternoons, her grandmother would hum gospel hymns while Chloe pressed the yellowed keys, fumbling through clumsy chords. They had no teacher, no lessons, just sound and memory and laughter. She hadn't touched a piano in years. Still, her fingers drifted to the keys. She pressed one softly, and a single note rose into the air, clear, haunting, suspended. The sound spread through the room like light. Then it faded, swallowed by silence. She pressed another, and another, clumsy, uneven, but alive. When she left that night, she thought no one had noticed. But the next evening when she returned, a slim book rested on the bench, Beginner's Classical Favorites. No note, no explanation. But she knew whose hand had placed it there. It wasn't the only gesture. One morning, a vase of crimson roses appeared on the dresser in her room. She hadn't ordered them, hadn't asked. The scent was delicate, lingering. There was no card, no words, but someone had thought of her. Chloe touched the petals soft as silk, and for the first time since the wedding, she smiled. These gestures did not erase the silence. At breakfast, he still hid behind his newspaper. At dinner, he still retreated into his study. They passed each other in corridors like ghosts inhabiting the same walls, and yet the edges had shifted. When she practiced on the piano, she felt eyes on her from the hallway, a presence that lingered, just out of sight. He never stepped inside, never interrupted, but he listened. When she returned from charity visits in Bronzeville, clothes smudged with chalk and paint after afternoons spent with children at the youth center, she sometimes caught him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite name. A faint crease at the corner of his mouth, a curiosity almost. Once, as she walked past him in the hall, he asked quietly, "What happened to your clothes?" "Life," she replied with a small shrug. "It's messy." And to her astonishment, his lips curved the faintest, almost imperceptible twitch of a smile. That night, she found a box outside her door. Inside, a set of professional oil pastels. He had noticed. Still, the walls between them held. William had mastered the art of detachment. He wore it like armor, every line of his posture, every measured glance declaring that nothing could breach him. But Chloe began to see the cracks. Late at night, when she crossed the living room on her way to bed, she sometimes glimpsed him standing before the window, a glass in hand, staring out at the city as if it demanded answers he couldn't give. His reflection was ghostly against the skyline, his shoulders taut, his jaw clenched, the weight of empires pressing invisibly upon him. She never spoke then. She only watched from the shadows, wondering what it cost him to stand so straight when no one was looking. It was on a rainy Friday that the silence broke. 3 black cars rolled to a stop outside the St. Regis Tower, and with them came the Walker family. His mother, Margaret Walker, stepped out, first heels sharp against marble perfume, as precise as her smile. She carried herself with the authority of someone who had never been told no. Behind her followed Raymond Walker, tall, severe, his presence filling the air with expectation. Chloe met them in the entryway, her terracotta dress plain compared to their tailored elegance. Margaret's eyes swept over her, from curls to bare fingernails. She took Chloe's hand, briefly, coolly. "So you're Chloe," Margaret said, the name on her tongue like something foreign. "I am," Chloe replied evenly. You are different than I imagined." "That's not always a bad thing," Chloe answered, her tone gentle but unflinching. Margaret's smile was cold, precise. "That depends on who's imagining." The dining room that night was a battlefield disguised as civility. Crystal gleamed, silverware sang against porcelain, and every word was measured currency. Raymond asked about her community work. Chloe spoke of the youth center in Bronzeville, of teaching art classes to children who had nowhere else to go. How charming, he said, without warmth. Perhaps quaint Margaret added her glass of wine poised like a weapon. But Alexander's world. She corrected herself with a flicker of disdain. William's world is larger than murals and chalkboards. Chloe set down her fork, her voice calm but firm. I never thought compassion had a size limit. Margaret's smile did not falter. But William shifted beside Chloe, his eyes unreadable, and that silence told her everything. Later that night, she found him in his study. The rain slicked the glass behind him, city lights bleeding into blurred streaks. He stood motionless, hands in his pockets. You said nothing, Chloe murmured from the doorway. I said enough. No. She whispered, her voice trembling not with fear, but with quiet conviction. You let them speak for you. His jaw tightened. They're difficult. You don't have to engage. But I live here. I bear your name. I'm not some shadow following you from gala to gala. His gaze snapped to hers. I never said you were. You didn't have to. Her voice broke. I've been quiet, William. Respectful. I've played the part. But I won't let them reduce me to a decorative compromise. His eyes narrowed, something dangerous stirring beneath the ice. That's not what this is. Then what am I to them? To you? He stepped closer slowly, as though weighing the risk. His voice dropped low, unguarded for once. To them, a disruption, an inconvenience, a reminder that they don't own every piece of me. Her breath caught. And to you? For a moment he said nothing. His hands flexed at his sides. To me? His voice faltered. Then he turned away, staring back at the rain. And Chloe understood. The answer was there, unsaid, hanging between them. She left before the silence could harden again. That night sleep eluded her. She stood before a blank canvas in the sitting room, hands stained in crimson and gold, painting until dawn. She painted fury and grief, dignity, and silence, her brushstrokes wild and unrestrained. When the sun rose, the canvas stood bold and defiant, a scream captured in color. She left it where anyone might see, even Margaret Walker if she dared. Because Chloe had decided something. She may have entered this world as a placeholder, but she would not remain one. The call came on a Wednesday. Chloe had been in the library, trying to lose herself in the faded spines of first editions she doubted William had ever read when her phone buzzed with a number she hadn't seen in years. Georgia area code. Her stomach dropped before she even answered. The voice on the other end was gentle, measured. Miss Murphy, this is Dr. Paley. I'm calling from Charleston General. Her throat tightened. The walls around her blurred. It's your grandmother. I think you should come. The room tilted. The chandelier above seemed to swing, though she knew it hadn't moved. Her grandmother. The woman who had raised her, loved her, braided her hair before church every Sunday. The one steady hand in a life filled with absences. Chloe pressed her palm against her chest as if she could hold her heart in place. I'll come, she whispered, though her voice was fractured. I'll come tonight. When William returned that evening, rain dripping from his overcoat, he found her on the rooftop terrace. The wind whipped her curls loose from their knot, her sweater far too thin for the March chill. She wrapped her arms around herself, trembling, though not from the cold. He said nothing at first, just stood beside her, a silent figure against the skyline. They called, she whispered, her eyes fixed on the glistening sprawl of the city. She's declining. Fast. His jaw tightened. He didn't ask who. He didn't need to. I need to go, she said. He nodded once. You should. Her head turned toward him, her eyes wide-searching. The press, you're bored. If I leave now, they'll let them talk. William interrupted, his voice firm, unflinching. And then, slowly, deliberately, his hand reached for hers. The touch undid her. Not because it was tender, but because it was real. I'll arrange everything, he said. The jet, a car, accommodations. Whatever you need. She gripped his hand tighter, desperate. Come with me. His eyes flickered, startled. You don't have to say anything, she added quickly. Just be there. For her. For me. For a long moment he said nothing. The city roared beneath them, 1,000 horns and engines and sirens demanding urgency. Then quietly he answered. Yes. 2 days later they left Chicago behind. The jet was sleek, immaculate, but the silence between them was different now. No longer hostile, no longer empty, necessary. Chloe watched him across the aisle, his head tilted slightly against the seatback, his brows furrowed, even in sleep. She wondered what he dreamed of, if he allowed himself to dream at all. She wondered who had convinced him that love was weakness, that vulnerability was a sin. For the first time since their wedding, she saw him outside the fortress of glass and marble. And he looked less like a titan of Wall Street, more like a man who had forgotten how to rest. The Charleston air was heavy, thick with humidity and honeysuckle. It clung to Chloe's skin, like memory carrying the sound of cicadas and the faint salt of the sea. The drive from the private airport wound through streets she had once known by heart, worn-down billboards, clapboard houses with peeling paint porches, sagging under the weight of time. Ghosts of her childhood seemed to rise with every turn. When they reached her grandmother's house, Chloe's chest constricted. The lawn was wild, the flower beds surrendered to weeds. Magnolia branches brushed the roof like unkempt hair, but the windows still gleamed, wiped with the care of someone who had always found dignity in small details. On the porch, the white rocking chair still waited, its cushion faded from coral to dusty rose. She's inside, William asked softly. Chloe nodded, unable to speak. He didn't move to rush her. He only stood beside her, waiting, letting her take her time. At last, she stepped forward, heels clicking against the porch wood that creaked like a heartbeat. She inhaled, exhaled, then pushed the door open. The air inside smelled of lavender oil and old wood. A heart monitor beeped softly, steady but fragile. Sunlight filtered through lace curtains, scattering delicate patterns across the floorboards. And there, in the small bedroom at the end of the hall, lay the woman who had once carried Chloe through every scraped knee and heartbreak. Her grandmother's body seemed swallowed by pillows and blankets, her skin pale, her frame shrunken. But her eyes, oh, her eyes still burned with the fire of recognition. Chloe girl, came the rasping whisper. Chloe dropped to her knees at the bedside, her tears falling freely. She clutched the frail hand in both of hers, pressing her lips against paper-thin skin. I'm here, she sobbed. I'm here, Grandma. William stayed in the hallway. He did not intrude, though the sound of their voices carried to him. Chloe's low and trembling, her grandmother's rasping but steady. He stood still, hands in his pockets, staring at the faded wallpaper, listening. Minutes passed. Hours, maybe. He lost count. When Chloe finally emerged, her eyes were red, but steady, her arms wrapped around herself like a shield. She remembered you, she whispered. He blinked. What? She saw the wedding announcement in a magazine, Chloe explained, a tired smile flickering at her lips. She's been waiting for me to bring you here. For the first time in years, William didn't know what to say. So Chloe took his hand and pulled him into the room. He had expected to feel like an intruder, a billionaire in a house that barely measured 1,000 square feet. But her grandmother's eyes, found him with startling clarity, stripping away his armor, his name, his empire. "Don't stand there like a mannequin, boy," she croaked, her voice weak but sharp. "Sit." And he did, on a rickety wooden chair beside the bed, its legs uneven against the floor. Her hand was thin, trembling, but her grip was firm when she reached for his. "You made her cry," she said simply. He swallowed. "I did. You planning to fix that?" He hesitated, then softer than he intended. "I'm trying." Her eyes searched his face for a long moment. Then she nodded once. "Don't take too long. She acts strong, but her heart bruises easy." Chloe let out a quiet, embarrassed laugh, dabbing at her tears. "Grandma?" "You hush," the older woman murmured. "I may be dying, but I still know how to speak truth." And with that, her eyes closed, her breathing evening out as she drifted into sleep. The room grew quiet, the heart monitor a steady metronome. Chloe sat on one side of the bed, William on the other. For the first time, the silence between them didn't feel cold. It felt shared. The next few days unfolded slowly, like the gentle unraveling of a thread. Chloe rarely left the house. She read to her grandmother, fed her spoonfuls of broth, adjusted pillows, whispered prayers under her breath. When grief threatened to crush her, she stepped outside to paint in the backyard, the shade of the old pecan tree her only refuge. William remained near. He didn't hover. He didn't intrude. But he was there, taking calls on the porch, walking to the corner store for groceries, fixing the bathroom cabinet hinge without being asked. One morning, Chloe found him barefoot in the grass. His sleeves rolled a mug of coffee in his hand. He stood watching the sunrise, his profile softened by the dawn. For a man accustomed to glass towers and gilded ballrooms, he seemed strangely at home here, as if the skyline of Charleston made more sense than all the marble in Chicago. They didn't speak much during those days, but something unspoken grew in the spaces between them. A softness, a reverence. On the third evening, they sat side by side on the porch swing. The June air clung heavy with heat, the wood beneath them creaking with every shift. "She taught me to be hard," Chloe said quietly, staring at the horizon. "Not because she wanted me to, but because she had to." William turned his head slightly, listening. "When my mother left, Grandma didn't blink. She tied on her apron and got to work. She carried me through every scraped knee, every disappointment. She loved me enough to teach me survival." "You loved her more than anyone," he said softly. "I love her," Chloe corrected, her voice breaking. "Still." Silence stretched. Then he asked, "Is that how you want to be loved, with survival?" Her gaze met his, deep and unflinching. "Yes and no. I want to be seen too, not just loved for enduring, but understood for living, for wanting, for feeling too much and never enough." The swing groaned. The cicadas sang. He looked away, his jaw tight, as though her words had struck something raw inside him. She didn't press, but she felt it, the walls he carried like armor, trembling, no longer steel, but something softer, something waiting. Her grandmother passed on a Wednesday morning. Chloe was holding her hand. There were no final declarations, no grand last words. Just a quiet exhale, a sigh that left the room both full and empty. The funeral was small. Neighbors, church friends, a few distant cousins. Chloe wore a plain black dress, her curls tied back, her face bare of makeup. A gold pin glimmered in her hair, the one her grandmother had given her when she got into Howard University. William stood beside her, silent, solid. When the choir began, Precious Lord, take my hand. Chloe's fingers sought his without thinking, and he held her hand, not because he knew how, but because for once she let him. That night, they didn't return to a hotel. They stayed in her grandmother's home, the air still rich with lavender, and wood memory pressed into every creak of the floor. They sat on the living room floor, surrounded by photo albums, sipping whiskey from mismatched mugs. Chloe flipped through a page and let out a soft laugh. This was my 6th grade dance. I wore Converse with my dress and cried because my crush danced with someone else. William leaned over his shoulder, brushing hers. "Which one are you?" She pointed to a skinny girl with wild curls and stubborn eyes. "I'd have danced with you," he said, voice low. She turned to him, startled. His eyes were soft, honest. "No cameras, no contracts," he added. "Just me, and you, and those ridiculous sneakers." She didn't laugh. Instead, she leaned forward and kissed him. Not out of pity, not out of grief, but because the space between them had asked for it again and again. And now she had stopped saying no. His hand found her waist, hesitant at first, then firmer, as if he too had been waiting. When they broke apart, breathless, Chloe pressed her forehead to his. "Are you afraid?" she whispered. "Terrified," he admitted. "Good," she said, with a trembling smile. "So am I." That night they made love in the room where Chloe had once fallen asleep to bedtime stories and gospel hums. The creaking bed, the faded curtains, the worn floorboards, all of it imperfect, all of it real. For the first time, William Walker's armor cracked open, and for the first time, Chloe Murphy allowed herself to hope. Chicago did not wait. The moment their car pulled up to the Walker Tower, the flashbulbs erupted. Dozens of cameras clustered behind barricades, their lenses like bayonets, their questions like stones hurled through the air. "Mr. Walker, is it true? Your wife's grandmother passed away? Chloe, are you returning to your charity work now? Was this trip a publicity stunt to soften your image? Mr. Walker." Chloe froze. The humid South Carolina air still clung to her skin, heavy with hymns and lavender, and the violence of Chicago's cold lights felt cruel. William placed a hand at the small of her back, firm, steady. He didn't speak to the reporters, didn't acknowledge the cacophony. He simply guided her forward, shielding her from the lunging microphones, his body a wall of silence between her and the frenzy. The elevator swallowed them whole, steel doors closing with a finality that echoed like sanctuary. Inside, the silence was deafening after the chaos. Chloe's reflection trembled in the mirrored walls, eyes tired, lips pale, her grandmother's gold pin still tucked into her curls. William held her hand longer than necessary before letting go. The penthouse looked exactly as they had left it. The glass walls gleamed. The marble floors reflected the city's glitter. The air smelled faintly of roses, though they had long since withered. But nothing inside them was the same. Chloe drifted toward the window, her arms wrapped around herself. Beyond the glass, Chicago glittered like a promise made of ice. Behind her, William poured 2 glasses of wine, placing one silently at her elbow. She didn't touch it. "Do you regret coming with me?" she asked, her voice low, fragile. He paused, his back to her, his silhouette carved against the skyline. "No." She turned, searching his face. Even with what they're saying, his eyes met hers, unwavering. "Let them talk." Her laugh was bitter, hollow. "You know it won't stop there. They'll dig. My past, my neighborhood, my father. every mistake I've ever made." He set his glass down. "Then let them." Her breath caught anger and sorrow swirling inside her. "Easy for you to say. You were born to this. White, male, a walker. You're allowed to fail. I was raised knowing one mistake could erase everything." The words hung heavy, undeniable. He didn't argue. He only stepped closer, his hand brushing hers briefly. "Then let's not give them that power." But the vultures circled faster than either of them expected. 2 days later, the tabloids screamed across digital billboards, "Billionaire's bride or strategic pawn inside the curious marriage of William Walker." The article bled venom, anonymous sources dissecting Chloe's past, spinning her scholarship into charity, her work at the youth center into desperation, her background into a rags-to-riches fairy tale, too suspiciously neat. "She's charming," one unnamed socialite was quoted, "but she doesn't belong." Chloe read it at dawn, standing barefoot on the balcony. The paper trembled in her hands. The wind whipped at the edges until the words blurred into nonsense, but the sting of them burrowed deep. By the time William saw the article, she was gone. He found her hours later in the sculpture garden at the Art Institute. She stood alone before Rodin's, the burghers of Calais, her arms wrapped tight around her waist. The bronze figures loomed, stooped, burdened, eternal martyrs of sacrifice. She looked as though she might collapse beneath their weight. "I should have expected it," she said without turning. Her voice was calm, but too calm, the kind that only came from holding back fire. William stopped beside her, his hands in his pockets. He stared at the sculptures with her, as if they held the answer. "They used to ignore me," she continued. "Back when I was just a girl, with paint-stained jeans, and a sketchbook full of forgotten faces. Now they want to tear me open for sport." His jaw tightened. "You don't have to justify your place in this world." Her eyes flicked toward him, dark and tired. "Maybe not to you, but to them. Every glance, every headline, it's a test, a reminder." He turned fully then, meeting her gaze. His voice dropped steady and fierce. "Then, let me remind them who you are." Her lips parted, disbelief flickering across her face. "And who am I?" He reached into his coat pocket and unfolded a paper. A press release. Short, sharp, unmistakable. Signed by him. "Walker Holdings reaffirms our full support and pride in Mrs. Chloe Walker. Her legacy, her work, and her presence within our family reflect the future we aim to build, a future led not by pedigree but by purpose." She stared at it, her throat tight. "You went public. I already did." Her breath stuttered. "Won't the board?" "They already tried to object," he said coolly. "I reminded them. I own 61%. Her chest constricted, a strange heat rising. "You're not a liability," Chloe Williams said, his voice low, deliberate. "You're the only thing in my world I didn't buy or inherit, and I'll defend that." The words weren't poetry. They weren't even romantic, but they were real, and she felt something deep within her bend, like iron softening in fire. The storm only grew. By the weekend, invitations once delivered with velvet envelopes were politely rescinded. Vogue canceled an editorial. A Carter Foundation trustee muttered about upholding tradition. Even within Walker Holdings, whispers spread like a virus, rumors that William had grown reckless, that his marriage had made him weak. One evening he returned late from a board meeting, his knuckles scraped raw. Chloe found him in the kitchen, his tie undone, his shoulders heavy. She reached for his hand, frowning at the small wound. "You're bleeding." He glanced down, dismissive. "Got into it with a door." Her lips curved despite herself. Did the door win? A shadow of a smile touched his face. Barely. She cleaned the wound in silence, wrapping gauze around his knuckle. "Are you tired?" she asked softly. "Yes," he admitted, his voice raw. Then he lifted his gaze. "But not of you." Something inside her unraveled. She reached up, cupping his face. "Then fight for yourself," she whispered. "Not just for me." His eyes closed, his breath unsteady. "I don't know how anymore." "Start small," she murmured. "Start here." That night they lay together for the first time since Charleston, not with the wild urgency of grief, but with the quiet surrender of trust. Their bodies folded into one another, not out of lust, but comfort. Her cheek against his chest, his hand tracing the curve of her back, as if memorizing her. Chloe, whose strength had been forged in survival. William, whose power had never taught him how to feel. Together they began to learn something new. Not how to escape the world, but how to exist within it, fragile, flawed, and human. The following week, the annual Walker Gala approached. It was the crown jewel of the family's empire, a night of power politics and pristine optics. William had once called it his battlefield. This year, it would be their reckoning. Chloe stood before the mirror, the night of the event, her gown the color of midnight. Jeweled combs pinned her curls into a crown, their faint sparkle catching the light. Behind her, William adjusted his cufflinks, his reflection sharp beside hers. "You're breathtaking," he murmured. She turned, her smile faint. "You're nervous." He exhaled once, slow, terrified. When he offered his hand, she took it. No hesitation. And together they stepped into the light. The flashbulbs were merciless. Questions flew like daggers. "Mrs. Walker, do you still live in the penthouse? Mr. Walker, is your marriage surviving the scandal? Are you adopting the child from the photo, Chloe?" Neither flinched. Their hands remained clasped, their steps deliberate. They moved like two people who had bled in private and now chose to endure in public. Inside the grand ballroom, chandeliers bloomed overhead like frozen gardens. The air glittered with crystal and silk. But beneath it all, Chloe felt eyes, whispers, scrutiny, pressing down on her like stones. And then a shift. Guests began to approach, not the elite, not the sycophants, but artists, teachers, alumni from her workshops. A young woman with dreadlocks and trembling hands told her, "You taught me pain doesn't have to be pretty to be powerful." A mother whispered, "Your story gave me courage to fight for my son." Chloe listened. She remembered every name. And when she glanced at William, he wasn't just watching her, he was marveling. Not like a man who owned her, but like a man who had finally understood what it meant to stand beside someone irreplaceable. Later, on the balcony overlooking the glittering park, William wrapped a shawl around her shoulders. His voice was quiet. "You could have left me. No one would have blamed you." Chloe leaned against him. "But I would have blamed myself for walking away before I knew if we were worth the risk." His breath caught. "And are we?" She turned, meeting his gaze. Her eyes gleamed. "We're precisely the kind of risk worth falling for." That night, the world still doubted them. But for the first time, Chloe didn't doubt herself. And William. William no longer doubted her. It began with a single grainy picture. The kind of photo one might scroll past on a gossip blog, cropped, blurred, poorly lit. A candid that should have disappeared into the noise of digital chatter. But this one did not, because it showed Chloe Walker. She sat on a park bench, her body curled protectively around a boy, no older than 6. His hair was dark, a halo of curls, his eyes too bright even in the grain of the image. He leaned into her, his cheek pressed against her shoulder, with the easy trust of a child who knew her heartbeat. The caption beneath it read, "Is this the secret son of Mrs. William Walker?" By morning, it was everywhere. Screens, tabloids, headlines blazing across LED billboards in Times Square on Michigan Avenue. News anchors spoke her name with the hushed relish of scandal. Talk show panels dissected timelines, and anonymous sources whispered, "Poison." Who was the boy? Why had Chloe hidden him? Was William Walker raising another man's child? Speculation swelled like a storm tide. William saw the headline before she did. He was in the middle of a meeting when his assistant slid the tablet across the polished boardroom table, her hand trembling. He stared at the screen for 5 full seconds, the blood draining from his face, the world narrowing to that photograph. The boy's smile. Chloe's arms around him. The room around him, blurred voices, muffled numbers, meaningless. The drone of conversation collapsing into static. Without a word, William rose the scrape of his chair, loud in the sudden hush. He left the meeting, left the tower, left his empire behind him. A storm was building inside him, cold and merciless. He found her hours later in the studio she had carved for herself, in one of the penthouse's forgotten rooms. The air smelled of turpentine and oil paint. Canvases leaned against the walls, each one a riot of color. Fury in red, sorrow in blue, dignity in gold. Chloe stood before one of them, brush in hand, her wrist stained with pigment. She was painting in silence, each stroke frantic, as if trying to bury her grief in color before it consumed her. She looked peaceful almost in that moment, unaware, untouched by the firestorm outside. Chloe. Her name spoken low, urgent. She turned, startled. The brush slipped from her hand, landing with a soft thud against the drop cloth. The moment her eyes met the tablet in his hand, she stilled, her lips parted, color draining from her face. He held it out wordlessly. The photo stared back at her. She pressed a hand against her mouth, a choked sound escaping. "They found him," she whispered. The silence that followed was worse than shouting. Not anger, not disbelief. Grief, raw and shapeless, settling between them like fog. Chloe sank onto the edge of the couch, her fingers trembling. "I never wanted you to find out like this," she said hoarsely. "Not from strangers, not like a weapon." William stood across from her, rigid, every muscle drawn tight. His voice was rough when it came. "Do you have a child?" Her eyes closed. A tear slid down her cheek. "I had a child." The words carved the air open. He blinked. "Explain." Her breath trembled as she began. His name was Isaiah. Born when Chloe was 20. The child of a summer romance with a boy from her neighborhood. A dreamer, a musician, kind, but restless. He had promised forever, but forever lasted only until responsibility pressed down harder than music ever could. They had nothing. No money, no stability. But Chloe fought. She worked double shifts at diners, cleaned offices at dawn, painted at night, when Isaiah slept curled against her side. Her grandmother helped her, laughter wrapping around the boy like sunlight. They made do. They survived. For 6 years, Isaiah was her everything. Her reason to breathe, her reason to rise every morning. And then, one winter, his father came back. He asked to take Isaiah for the holidays. Just a few days, he promised. Chloe was reluctant, but the court papers granted him shared custody. She kissed her son goodbye, promised she would see him on New Year's Eve. He never returned. Weeks turned into months. She called, begged, reported him missing. She scraped together what little money she had to hire a private investigator, But Isaiah's father had vanished. Changed names, moved states, erased himself. The authorities told her it wasn't abduction. He had legal rights. There was no crime. Only a broken mother, a child ripped from her arms by the cold machinery of law. "I haven't seen Isaiah in 3 years," Chloe said, her voice shaking. "But I write him letters every month. I keep his drawings. I celebrate his birthday alone." Her hands covered her face. "I didn't tell you because I couldn't say it out loud without breaking. And I didn't want your world to eat him alive the way it eats everything else." William sat down slowly, as if the weight of her words had pressed him into the couch. His voice was quiet, raw. "Why didn't you trust me?" Tears welled in her eyes. "Because I didn't trust anyone." Her confession hung in the air, fragile, shattering. He looked at her, then really looked at the woman who had carried grief in silence, who had built her strength on survival. And for the first time he felt the sharp edge of helplessness, not because of scandal, not because of headlines, but because of pain he could not erase. The next day the world turned crueler. The media storm exploded. Some headlines painted her as a tragic heroine, a mother trapped in custody battles. Others branded her a liar, a fraud, a woman who had hidden her past for convenience. Talk shows dissected her silence, spinning narratives out of speculation. And William said nothing. He released no statement. He stood at no podium. He withdrew, as though the weight of too many versions of Chloe had pressed him into silence. The fearless, defiant Chloe, the grieving mother, the secret keeper. For the first time, he did not know which was real. Chloe buried herself in the studio. She painted until her hands ached, until her vision blurred. Canvases filled with jagged silhouettes and screaming color reds bleeding into blacks, blues, swallowing gold. Every brushstroke a cry she couldn't voice. Every canvas a grave for words unsaid. One evening, the sound of heels clicked against the marble. Margaret Walker appeared, uninvited perfume preceding her. She stepped into the studio as though she owned it, her eyes sharp, her lips curved in a smile that wasn't a smile. "I warned you," she said, not unkindly. "This world isn't built to cradle a woman like you." Chloe didn't turn from her canvas. "I don't need cradling." Margaret's eyes narrowed. "You think silence is strength, but in our world, silence is death." Chloe set down her brush. Her voice was calm, but each word cut clear. "My silence isn't shame, it's survival." Margaret studied her for a long moment, something flickering in her gaze. Not warmth, not approval, but recognition. "You may not survive this marriage," she said finally. Chloe lifted her chin. "That's not your call." Margaret tilted her head. "No, but it will be his." Then she turned and left her heels echoing like judgment. That night, Chloe found William in his study. He sat behind his desk, a bottle of scotch untouched beside him. His eyes were shadowed, his shoulders heavy. "You don't believe me," she said quietly. He looked up startled. "I do. But you don't know what to do with that belief," she whispered. He didn't answer. Her hands clenched at her sides. "Do you think I'm a liar? A fraud? No. Then what am I to you?" His silence lasted too long. Finally, he exhaled, his voice low. "Someone I haven't fully met yet." The words cut deeper than accusation. Chloe's throat tightened. She nodded once as though sealing something inside. "Then we both need to decide if we even want to meet each other again," she said. "For real. Without masks. Without contracts." And this time, she left him alone in his silence. 2 days later, William disappeared. Not entirely. He still went to meetings, still appeared in headlines, still signed contracts worth billions. But from Chloe he vanished. No texts, no calls. The staff whispered that he was staying at the Walker estate in the Hamptons. Chloe did not follow. Instead, she packed a single suitcase. She moved into a modest brownstone in Bronzeville, the one she had once rented, before her name was Walker. The furniture was mismatched. The heater groaned, but the windows caught the golden light of evening, and the silence belonged to her again. She threw herself back into community work, mentoring girls, teaching art, building a gallery project for underprivileged artists. And every night, she wrote Isaiah a letter. The city moved on. Scandal faded, replaced by fresher blood for the tabloids. But whispers lingered in private corners about the woman who had walked away from billions, who rebuilt herself without bitterness, who never sold her story. And in a tower of glass on Michigan Avenue, William Walker read every word. He carried them in silence, but he carried them all the same. Autumn had begun its slow descent over Chicago. The air was crisper. The leaves gilded in amber, and scarlet swept across sidewalks like confetti from some forgotten celebration. In Bronzeville, the small brownstone Chloe now called home breathed with life in ways the penthouse never had. Her mornings began with sunlight filtering through mustard yellow curtains, spilling onto canvases lined against the walls. She brewed her own coffee sweetened with cinnamon and oat milk, sipping it while the city outside woke to its restless rhythm. Here, silence belonged to her. No reporters stationed outside. No marble floors echoing with absence. No walls made of glass that turned her into a reflection of a life she hadn't chosen. For the first time in months, she exhaled without fear that her breath would be measured. She returned to the youth center in Bronzeville quietly, without announcement. The building smelled of chalk crayons and fried food from the takeout shop across the street. Miss Chloe Brielle's voice rang out as soon as she entered the art room. The girl launched herself forward, her fingers stained in blue paint. Chloe knelt, hugging her close. The children swarmed, her laughter filling the space with warmth she hadn't realized she'd been starving for. She slipped back into the rhythm, seamlessly teaching, guiding, listening. Her afternoons were spent crouched over easels, encouraging hesitant strokes, celebrating wild splashes of color. At night, she walked home with paint on her jeans, her heart raw but alive. For every child she guided, she felt closer to Isaiah, though he was miles away, a phantom tether woven into her every breath. Meanwhile, in his glass tower, William Walker moved like a ghost. Meetings filled his hours, signatures filled his days, but nothing silenced the gnawing ache that had taken root since Chloe left. At first, he told himself it was necessary. Distance. Time. He had built empires from control, from suppressing weakness, and silence was the only weapon he knew. But silence in the penthouse was no longer armor. It was absence. He found himself lingering on the side of the bed she had once slept, in the faint scent of lavender and paint, still etched into the sheets. He walked past the piano she had played at midnight, but the room now echoed hollow. He avoided the kitchen where once he had found her humming quietly over a mug of coffee. For the first time, his fortress felt like a cage. 3 months passed. One afternoon, an envelope arrived at his office. No return address. Inside, a single folded paper. A child's drawing, 2 stick figures, a woman with a red scarf and a boy with curls, both smiling beneath a crooked sun. At the bottom, scrawled in uneven handwriting, "Dear Mommy, I miss you too." William stared at it until the lines blurred. He pressed the paper to his chest, a tremor running through him. It wasn't the ink that shook him. It was the folds, the creases that spoke of a boy carrying it everywhere, holding on to hope until the crayon itself had begun to fade. That night, William didn't touch his scotch. He didn't open his laptop. He sat alone in his office, the drawing folded carefully into the pocket of his suit, positioned directly over his heart. For Chloe, the days blurred into color and sound. She painted until her hands ached. She spoke at shelters mentored girls, whose eyes carried the same hunger she once bore. She organized a gallery for the children, filling a community hall with their work bright galaxies, jagged cityscapes, dreams on paper. When she walked home through the crisp autumn air, her steps echoed with both freedom and loneliness. She missed him. Not the billionaire, not the Walker Empire. Him, the man who had stood barefoot in Charleston grass at sunrise, who had clumsily cooked stew with smoke alarms blaring, who had held her hand at her grandmother's funeral. But missing him wasn't the same as trusting him. So she wrote letters to Isaiah, one every week, letters she never knew if he received, letters she poured her heart into, as if words could bridge an absence that had grown into a chasm. By winter, whispers had shifted. New scandals consumed the city. The tabloids moved on. But William hadn't. The drawing never left his pocket. He carried it to board meetings, into cars, even into bed, as though its fragile folds were a lifeline. James Walker, his father, noticed. "It's time to move past the fiasco," he said one evening, voice sharp with impatience. William said nothing. His silence was a wall even his father couldn't scale. Until one night, he could no longer bear the distance. 3 days later, he stood before a brownstone in Bronzeville, his breath clouding in the cold air, his hand trembling against his side. The curtains glowed mustard yellow light, spilling like warmth onto the street. He knocked. The door opened slowly. Chloe stood barefoot, a scarf tied loosely around her curls, paint smudged on her wrist. Her eyes widened, unreadable. Neither spoke at first. The city murmured behind them, traffic rolling by, wind curling around the eaves. He reached into his pocket and handed her the folded drawing. Her fingers closed around it, unfolding it carefully. She stared at the familiar crayon lines, her breath catching. Her voice was hushed, trembling. "I wasn't the one who sent it." "I know," William said. Her eyes lifted to his. "But you kept it." "I didn't know how not to." They stood on opposite sides of the threshold, two people who had once shared vows beneath chandeliers, now separated by a door thinner than paper. Then, finally, Chloe stepped aside. "Come in." The inside smelled of lemon oil and lavender. Books stacked on shelves, canvases leaning against walls, a photo of her grandmother by the windowsill, her smile, timeless. On the fridge, a new drawing, different lines, different colors, another child's work from the center. William took it all in silently. "Tea?" Chloe asked, already moving toward the stove. He nodded, his voice caught in his throat. They sat across from each other at the small table, mismatched mugs between them. He looked tired shadows under his eyes, deeper than she remembered. "You look—" she began, then stopped. He offered a faint smile. "I am." "From what?" His gaze found hers, steady and raw. "Pretending I was fine without you." Her breath trembled. She didn't answer. Later, she led him to her studio. Light from slanted windows poured over canvases, half-finished brushstrokes alive with chaos and longing. He walked slowly, his gaze stopping on one piece in particular, a woman on a rooftop, her scarf flung by wind, her back to the skyline. Her eyes painted with ruthless precision, burned with sorrow, too vast for the canvas. "She doesn't look broken," he said softly. Chloe's voice came from behind him. "She isn't. She looks like she's waiting." She was. He turned. For what? For someone to stop seeing her as a liability and start seeing her as a choice. His chest ached. He swallowed. She was never a liability. Then why did you leave? His answer was quiet, fragile. Because I didn't believe I deserved to stay. Tears glistened in her eyes, but her voice was steady. You don't get to decide what you deserve, William. But you do decide what you fight for. Silence filled the studio, heavy but alive. And for the first time, he let it be enough. That night, he didn't stay. When he left, the air between them was still uncertain, trembling on the edge of something not yet named. But for the first time since their unraveling, the door had opened. And Chloe knew deep in her chest that some distances are not measured in miles, but in courage. It began with a rhythm. Every morning at precisely 7:12, there was a knock on Chloe's brownstone door. Not 7:10, not 7:15, always 7:12. Like the exact minute mattered, like he had calculated the sliver of sunlight that fell across her living room floor at that hour and decided it belonged to her. At first, Chloe thought it was coincidence, but when it happened again and again, she understood. William Walker was knocking. The first morning she didn't answer. She pressed her back against the door, her breath caught in her throat, listening to the silence that followed the soft rap of his knuckles. After a minute, his footsteps retreated steady and unhurried. The second morning, she opened the door a crack. He stood there in his dark coat, holding 2 cups of coffee. From the shop around the corner, he said simply, "Almond milk, no syrup." Her eyes flickered. He remembered. She didn't invite him in. She only took the coffee, nodded once, and closed the door. But the warmth lingered in her palms long after. By the 4th morning, she left the door ajar. He stepped inside quietly like a guest who had not yet earned permission to belong. He didn't comment on the mismatched furniture, the canvases drying against the walls, the books stacked in uneven piles. He only set the coffee on her table and sat on the floor with his back against the wall, as though this was where he was meant to be. Chloe painted. He read, or sometimes only watched the light shift across the room. They did not speak much. They did not need to. By the 2nd week, he began fixing things. The dripping faucet in her kitchen fell silent. The bathroom hinge no longer squeaked. A light bulb in the hallway glowed steady where before it had flickered. He didn't ask. He didn't make a show of it. One afternoon, she came home with paint smudged across her jeans to find him kneeling in front of her stove, sleeves rolled up, a damp cloth in his hand. The stovetop gleamed in a way it hadn't since she moved in. Her eyebrows arched. "You cleaning?" He didn't look up, trying. She leaned against the doorframe, watching him. The man the world called untouchable, ruthless, immaculate, scrubbing quietly in her kitchen. It unsettled her, and yet it softened her too. Because he wasn't trying to impress her. He was trying to be present, and presence, Chloe realized, was rarer than diamonds. One rainy evening, she returned later than usual. As she opened the door, music drifted softly through the brownstone. Not piano, not strings, a record player, low and crackling. Etta James, her grandmother's favorite. Her steps faltered. William stood in the kitchen barefoot, an apron far too large tied loosely around his waist. A pot of lentil stew simmered on the stove. One bowl was set on the table. One glass of wine poured. "You cooked?" she asked, incredulous. He glanced up, sheepish. Attempted. "Your neighbor came over to stop the smoke alarm. Twice." Laughter broke from her, sudden and real. Not because the joke was clever, but because her chest felt light for the first time in months. They sat across from each other, knees brushing beneath the small wooden table. Steam rose between them, the scent of garlic and cumin filling the air. He asked about her day. She told him about Brielle, the girl at the youth center, who painted galaxies with her fingers, and Marcus, who refused to use any color but green. He listened, truly listened, not to respond, but to hear. And Chloe felt herself unraveling, thread by thread. Later, as they washed dishes side by side, water splashing against porcelain, William asked softly, "May I see where you paint?" Her hand stilled on a plate. For a moment, she hesitated. The studio was her refuge, the only space untouched by contracts and headlines. But something in his voice, a quiet reverence not demand, made her nod. She led him upstairs. The small room glowed with lamplight canvases lined against every wall. Some half-finished, others vibrant and whole. Colors bloomed wild, unrestrained pain, joy, defiance, splashed in strokes too raw to hide. He moved slowly, taking them in. His gaze lingered on a painting of a woman standing on a rooftop, her scarf whipping in the wind, her eyes burning with sorrow too vast for the frame. "She doesn't look defeated," he murmured. Chloe's voice was soft behind him. "She isn't. She looks like she's waiting." She was. He turned, meeting her gaze. "For what?" "For someone to stop looking at her like a burden," she whispered, "and start seeing her as a choice." His chest tightened. He stepped closer, every word dragged from somewhere unarmored. "She was never a burden." "Then why did you leave?" He faltered, the truth breaking loose before he could catch it. "Because I didn't believe I deserved to stay." The silence that followed was heavy trembling. Chloe closed the distance between them, her voice a whisper against the storm in his eyes. "You don't get to choose what you deserve, but you do decide what you fight for." For once, William Walker had no words, only breath, only her. It happened on a Thursday, a downpour so sudden, the streets turned silver. The city blurred behind a curtain of glass. Chloe was in her studio, restless windows open, letting the storm soak the air. She called out without thinking. William's silence answered. He had meetings, a life, to rebuild, a reputation to salvage. She almost laughed at herself until a knock came. She turned, startled. And there he was. Soaked through hair, dripping breath uneven, his eyes bright like a man who had run through the storm, simply because she had spoken his name. "You called," he said, and in that moment she knew. He would always answer. That night they danced. No music, just the sound of rain against glass, the shuffle of bare feet on wood. Her arms wound around his neck. His hands, cautious at first, found her waist. They moved slowly, wordlessly. Not a waltz, not a tango. Just two people learning each other again, not with urgency, but reverence. Chloe rested her cheek against his shoulder, her eyes closing. For the first time, silence felt like safety. When she lifted her gaze, she traced the scar above his left eyebrow. "How did you get this?" she asked softly. He hesitated. "Then I fell. Age 10. Tried to climb my father's library shelves. Reached too high." Her lips curved faintly. "You've always aimed for the impossible." He chuckled once low, and fell for it. She didn't move her fingers. But this he said, suddenly catching her hand, placing it against his chest, over the steady thud of his heart. "This is the one thing I don't want to fall from." Her breath trembled. Their eyes locked. For the first time since their unraveling, she didn't look away. The next morning there was no knock. Instead, when Chloe entered her kitchen, she found William already there, coffee-ready toast, burned a small velvet box on the table. Her heart lurched, but when she opened it, there was no ring, only a key. "To your world," he said quietly, Not mine, not the penthouse, not the Walker name. To this place. To you. Her throat tightened. I don't want you to move back, he continued. I want to be invited in. For a long moment she stared at the key glinting in her palm, the simplest, most devastating vow he had ever given her. Then she closed her fingers around it, and for the first time, she let herself believe in beginnings. The first snow of winter dusted Chicago in silence. Chloe awoke to the pale light of morning spilling across her studio. The city outside muffled beneath its new white cloak. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders as she leaned against the window pane watching children on the street throw handfuls of snow into the air, their laughter clouding like warm breath against the cold. Behind her, the brownstones smelled of turpentine and rosemary tea. The canvases she had left drying the night before shimmered faintly in the morning glow, paint strokes still wet and glistening. And then came the knock. 7:12, as always. She hesitated for a beat, her hand hovering over the doorknob, before pulling it open. William stood there, his coat dusted with snow, holding 2 cups of coffee that steamed in the frigid air. His hair was damp at the edges, his breath visible. You're early, she said softly. I'm on time, he corrected, stepping inside when she moved aside. He placed the coffees on the table and shrugged out of his coat. The room seemed to shift when he entered, not in grandeur, but in quiet gravity. He filled the space, not with dominance, but with presence. Their mornings had taken on a rhythm unspoken yet steady. She painted. He read, sometimes drafting notes on his phone, but more often simply sitting on the floor, his back against the wall, watching light move across the room. He had learned the names of the children at the youth center through her stories. He remembered which ones liked blue, which ones drew only houses, which ones painted skies without suns. When she returned in the evenings, her jeans marked with chalk and paint, he would sometimes already be in her kitchen, clumsily preparing soup or pouring wine, or simply waiting with that patient stillness she was beginning to understand was his way of saying, I'm here. It was not romance, in the way the tabloids might imagine. No diamonds, no extravagance, no declarations. It was the scrape of his chair against wood when he stood to help her with dishes. It was the way he hung his coat by the door instead of draping it across her furniture. It was how he placed coffee on her table without needing to be thanked. And it was enough to begin healing something fragile inside her. One evening, as Chloe packed supplies for the youth center, William lingered in her studio. His gaze fell on a flyer pinned to the wall, a bright splash of paper announcing the Bronzeville Winter Arts Night. Community showcase, he asked. She turned, startled, he had noticed. Yes, the children have been preparing for weeks. It's their first time exhibiting their work outside the center. He studied the flyer, then looked at her. You'll be there. Of course. She hesitated, adjusting the straps of the canvas bag on her shoulder. It's not your kind of event. He tilted his head slightly. What is my kind? Boardrooms, galas, rooms where every word is currency. A faint smile tugged at his lips. Maybe I'd like to learn another language. Her breath caught, but she said nothing. The community hall glowed with string lights and paper lanterns, their warmth defying the winter cold. Long tables lined the room covered in canvases, sculptures made of recycled wood collages, bursting with color. The scent of hot cocoa and fried chicken mingled with paint and glue. Chloe moved easily among the children, adjusting displays, encouraging nervous smiles. She wore a simple burgundy dress, her curls pinned back with the gold comb her grandmother had given her. And then the room shifted. Because William Walker walked in. Not in Tom Ford, not in silk ties. He wore a dark wool coat and a plain sweater, snow still melting on his shoulders. His presence drew eyes whispers rippling through the crowd like a current. But he didn't carry himself like the man in headlines. He didn't stride with arrogance or command attention. He moved quietly, deliberately, toward Chloe. For the first time in her world, he wasn't a headline. He was simply there. The children clustered around Chloe wide-eyed. Miss Chloe Brielle whispered, tugging at her sleeve. "Is that him?" Chloe's lips curved faintly. "Yes, that's William." Brielle stared openly, then darted behind Chloe's arm as William crouched down to her level. "You must be the one who paints galaxies," he said softly. Her eyes widened. "You know?" He nodded. "Chloe told me." Brielle blushed, hiding her face. But when William asked if she'd show him her favorite piece, she grabbed his hand without hesitation. Chloe watched them, her chest tightening. The man she had once believed incapable of warmth knelt now before a child's painting of stars, listening as though it were the most important portfolio he had ever reviewed. Later that evening, as Chloe stood near a table of collages, one of the other teachers approached her. "You didn't tell us your husband would be here?" the woman said, her tone edged with both curiosity and awe. Chloe's throat tightened around the word husband. It felt both foreign and familiar. "He wanted to come," she said simply. Across the hall, William stood with Marcus, the boy who painted everything in green. He listened with solemn interest as Marcus explained why the sun, the grass, and the people in his world all wore the same shade. And Chloe realized something. William wasn't just attending. He was learning a world without chandeliers or cameras, a world where power meant showing up, not being obeyed. At the center of the hall hung one of Chloe's own pieces. It wasn't meant to be there. She had resisted at first, insisting the showcase was for the children. But the director had convinced her they should see what's possible. That art can tell stories beyond survival. The painting showed a woman standing barefoot in snow, her scarf wrapped tight, her arms cradling emptiness that still weighed like stone. Her eyes burned, not with despair, but with a defiance that cut through the cold. William stopped before it, motionless. Chloe joined him, her heart unsteady. "Is she you?" he asked, his voice quiet. Chloe didn't look at him. "She's every woman who has ever stood alone in winter." He studied the figure for a long time, then, almost to himself. "She doesn't look alone anymore." Her breath trembled. "Why not?" "Because she's being seen." She turned then, meeting his gaze, and in the flicker of string lights above them, something passed between them, fragile, undeniable. When the event ended, Chloe helped the children pack their artwork. William carried tables, fetched coats, moved with the steady ease of a man unbothered by the tasks. Parents whispered his name, astonished, at the Billionaire folding chairs in a community hall. On the walk back, the night air was sharp with cold snow, crunching beneath their boots. Chloe hugged her coat tighter, but her heart was warm. William walked beside her silent. Finally, she spoke. "You didn't have to come tonight." He glanced at her. "Yes, I did." Her steps slowed. "Why?" His voice was steady, stripped of its usual armor. "Because this is your world. And if I can't walk in it with you, then I don't deserve to walk beside you at all." The snow kept falling soft and endless, covering the city in white. And Chloe realized with a shiver that wasn't from the cold, that he had just offered her more than any contract or vow ever could. Not power, not protection, presence. And presence, she thought, was the beginning of love. The envelope arrived on a Thursday. It was cream-heavy stock, with the Walker family crest, embossed in gold. Chloe found it on her kitchen table that evening, placed neatly beside the coffee mug William had washed before leaving. Her name was written in calligraphy, Mrs. Chloe Walker. She traced the letters with her fingertip. Her breath caught between disbelief and dread. She hadn't seen the Walker crest since she'd walked away from the penthouse. Inside a single card, James Walker requests the honor of your presence at the annual Walker Foundation Gala. The Metropolitan Museum of Art. Saturday, January 14th. She stared at the date, at the words that carried the weight of empire and expectation. It was less invitation than command. When William returned that evening, his coat dusted with snow, she held the card out without a word. His jaw tightened. "My father," he said. Not a question. Chloe's lips pressed together. "Why now?" "Because he wants to see what I'll choose." For days, Chloe avoided the subject. She busied herself with the children's projects at the youth center, painted late into the night, let the minutes slip like sand through her fingers. But the card remained on the mantelpiece, an unspoken challenge. William didn't press. But she could feel the tension in him, the way his hand lingered on her back, when they walked down the street, the way he studied her face, when she wasn't looking, as though preparing for a battle. Neither of them had yet named. One evening, as snow fell in heavy sheets, she finally asked the question that haunted her. "Do you want me there?" They were sitting in her studio, the fire crackling canvases, glowing in lamplight. William looked up from the book he hadn't really been reading. "Yes." Her throat tightened. "Even if they use me against you." His gaze was steady, especially then. The Met glowed like a cathedral that evening, its grand facade bathed in golden light against the black January sky. Snowflakes drifted like sequins over the crowd of limousines and velvet gowns. Inside, chandeliers bloomed overhead, music swelled from a string quartet, and Chicago's elite shimmered in diamonds and whispers. When William and Chloe entered the room, paused. She wore midnight silk, her curls swept into a crown, pinned with her grandmother's comb. William stood beside her in a simple black tuxedo, his hand steady at her back. Flashbulbs flared, questions darted like arrows, but they walked forward, heads high, as though silence itself were their shield. James Walker awaited them at the base of the grand staircase. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his silver hair immaculate, his smile polished to a senator's gleam. Beside him stood Margaret, her gown the color of steel, her eyes as sharp. "William." James's voice carried the easy authority of a man used to being obeyed. "Father William," replied, his tone clipped, controlled. Then James turned to Chloe. He extended his hand, his smile precise. "Mrs. Walker, you look resilient." Chloe placed her hand in his, her grip firm, though her pulse thundered. "Thank you. I've had practice." Something flickered in James's eyes, surprise perhaps at her poise. But he only inclined his head, releasing her hand with a faint squeeze that felt less greeting than measurement. Dinner was a theater of politics. Crystal glasses, silver cutlery, each course delivered like a performance. Around them, senators, CEOs, artists, and heirs played their parts in whispers and glances. James spoke in polished anecdotes, guiding the conversation like a conductor. Margaret interjected with barbed sweetness, each comment cloaked in civility. And through it all, Chloe remained composed. She spoke of the youth center of the gallery she was building for underprivileged artists. Her words were simple, but her eyes burned with quiet conviction. Some guests leaned in with genuine interest. Others dismissed her with indulgent smiles. But William watched her with something close to awe. When one trustee asked if she found it overwhelming to adjust to the Walker name, Chloe smiled softly. Names don't overwhelm me. People do. But people are only people, whether they carry billions or backpacks. The table stilled. Even James glanced at her, his mask cracking for a moment. Later, needing air, Chloe stepped onto the balcony overlooking Central Park. The city stretched beneath her, glittering and cold. She wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders, her breath rising in pale clouds. Behind her footsteps, William joined her, his presence a steady warmth against the night. "You held your ground," he murmured. She gave a soft laugh. "Did I?" He turned, studying her. "You don't see it, do you?" They came looking for cracks, and all they found was steel, wrapped in grace. Her chest tightened. "Do you think it's enough?" His hand brushed hers, barely a touch. "For me, it's everything." For a moment, the city hushed, and it was only them two figures against a skyline stitched together by silence. When they returned inside, James was waiting. He drew William aside, his voice low but sharp. "You've changed." William met his father's gaze steadily. "I had to." James's lips curved, not in approval. "Be careful, son. Empires are not built on sentiment." William's reply was quiet, but it cut like steel. "No, but they fall without it." Chloe, standing nearby, caught the words. Her breath caught too. As the evening unfolded, something unexpected happened. Guests began seeking Chloe out. Not the sycophants or opportunists, but people who carried quieter truths. A teacher from Bronzeville who thanked her for supporting the youth center. A young artist who whispered that her story gave him courage to paint without apology. And when Chloe listened, when she touched their hands and remembered their names, William watched with a reverence that no empire could command. Not like a man defending his wife against the world, but like a man finally understanding what it meant to stand beside someone irreplaceable. As the gala drew toward its close, James approached once more, his expression unreadable. "You've made your choice, then," he said to William, his gaze flicking briefly to Chloe. William's voice was steady. "Yes, and you'll accept the consequences." William's hand found Chloe's, lacing their fingers together. "I already have." For the first time, James Walker had no reply. When the lights dimmed and the last notes of the quartet faded, Chloe and William left the Met together. Outside, the snow had begun again, soft flakes falling into Chloe's curls. William brushed one away gently, his touch lingering. "You're trembling," he murmured. She looked up at him, her eyes glimmering, not from fear, and as they walked into the winter night, Chloe realized something she hadn't dared believe since the day she signed that contract. She was no longer a placeholder in a billionaire's world. She was his choice, and perhaps for the first time, he was hers. The night after the Met felt like a fragile reprieve. Back at the brownstone, Chloe removed her grandmother's comb, setting it gently on the dresser. William hung his tuxedo jacket beside the coats in her narrow hallway, as though it had always belonged there. They didn't speak much. They didn't need to. The silence was soft, not heavy. A silence that said, "We survived tonight." But by morning, the world had shifted again. It was Brielle from the youth center who first showed Chloe the photo. A shaky printout folded into nervous hands. "Miss Chloe," the girl whispered. "Is this you?" The paper trembled as Chloe unfolded it. Her breath caught. There she was in the image, years younger, dressed in a simple cotton dress, her curls loose, her hand clutching that of a small boy. Isaiah. His laughter frozen mid-motion, her face turned toward him, with the kind of joy that did not need words. The headline above screamed across tabloids, digital banners, news broadcasts. The child she hid. Chloe Murphy Walker's forgotten past. By midday, the story had spread like fire through dry grass. Talk shows questioned her fitness as William Walker's wife. Anonymous voices speculated about Isaiah's father. Bloggers dissected timelines, whispering that Chloe had deliberately erased her son for convenience for ambition. She sat in her studio, the article glowing on her laptop, her chest hollow. It wasn't the exposure that hurt. She had lived with scrutiny long enough to grow calluses. It was Isaiah's face, pulled into the ravenous glare of strangers, his innocence devoured by headlines. When William entered, she closed the laptop too quickly, but he had already seen. Chloe. His voice was quiet, careful. She looked at him, her eyes rimmed red. They found him. He nodded once. Yes. Her hands trembled. Do you know what this means? Every moment of his life will be dissected. They'll dig for him the way they've dug for me. He's a child, William. I know. She turned away, clutching her elbows, her voice breaking. I can't let them destroy him. Not again. He crossed the room but stopped just short of touching her. Then we stand in front of it, together. Her laugh was bitter. You think your name can shield him? It couldn't shield me. His silence lasted a moment too long. Then softly, maybe I was late. But I'm here now. She turned her eyes fierce through tears. Being here now isn't enough if you can't carry what comes with me. His chest tightened, but he didn't look away. Then test me. Days later, the Walker Foundation board erupted. Whispers turned into demands. Trustees muttered about scandal, about investors pulling back. Optics, they said, their voices sharp as knives. Stability. William listened in silence, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. When one trustee dared to suggest publicly distancing himself from Chloe, the room stilled. William rose slowly, his gaze slicing through the table. If my marriage is your liability, he said evenly, then my presence is your loss. Remember who owns 61%. The room fell silent. For the first time in his career, William didn't defend profits. He defended Chloe. That night he returned to the brownstone exhausted, but unbroken. Chloe met him at the door, her expression wary. What did they say, she asked. That you're a problem. He stepped closer. That you're unfit. That you don't belong. Her breath caught. And what did you say? I said they don't belong without you. Tears welled in her eyes. For the first time since the article, she let herself lean into him, her forehead against his chest, his arms circling her with a certainty that anchored her, trembling. The press camped outside the brownstone. Cameras flashed whenever she stepped out. Children at the youth center whispered nervously, protective of her in their own small ways. But Chloe did not hide. She walked into the center each afternoon, her head high. She guided paint-stained hands, encouraged hesitant voices, told Isaiah's story not as shame, but as proof that love, however fractured, was still worth fighting for. And William was there. Not always speaking, but present. Carrying chairs, pouring cocoa, listening as children told him stories about colors and constellations. The storm outside raged, but inside those walls, Chloe found strength in being seen. A week later, James Walker summoned William. In the marble silence of the Walker estate, father and son stood face to face. You're risking everything, James said coldly. I'm protecting everything, William replied. Her? His father's lips curled. She's not your empire. William's voice dropped steady as iron. She's my choice, the only one I've ever made without you. The words hung in the air, heavier than any contract William had ever signed. For once, James said nothing. When Chloe heard what William had said, she didn't answer at first. They sat together in her studio lamplight, pooling across unfinished canvases. "You would risk your empire for me?" she asked quietly. He met her eyes. "No, for us." Her throat tightened, but she didn't look away. For the first time, she believed him. 2 days later, William did what no one expected. He called a press conference. The room was packed, cameras clicking, whispers crackling. He stood at the podium, immaculate in his suit, Chloe by his side, in a simple black dress. He spoke evenly, his voice carrying through the static. "Yes, Chloe Walker is my wife. Yes. She had a child before this marriage. That child is part of her story, and therefore, part of mine. If you cannot respect her, you do not respect me. And if you cannot respect us, then you do not deserve a place in the world we're building." Gasps rippled. Questions erupted. But William's hand found Chloe's steady, unshakable. For the first time, Chloe didn't feel like she was surviving a storm. She felt like she was standing in its eye with someone who refused to let her fall. That night back in the brownstone, they sat on the floor, their fingers intertwined, listening to the city hum outside. The world was still cruel, still loud, but inside these walls, they had carved out a truth the world could not erase. Chloe looked at William, his face softened by lamplight, his eyes stripped of armor. "Do you regret it?" she asked. "Never," he whispered. She leaned into him, her voice barely a breath. "Then maybe this is how love begins." And if you, watching their journey, have ever believed that love can rise even from brokenness, that standing together can silence even the harshest storm, then let this story remind you. Second chances are real. Tell me in the comments, if you were Chloe, would you have had the strength to stand in the storm tap, like if their story touched your heart? Follow so you don't miss where their journey goes next.